Hello, bienvenue. This is David Sneath, and I'm with Heavy D Storytelling, and I'm going to tell you a story. Tonight's story is from the Neverending Story. We're going to start with Chapter 3, Morla, the Aged One. A word about our viewers. I appreciate you guys tuning in and watching these stories, me rambling along while I try to read them. I hope that this is entertaining and fun. It is mostly for my children, but anyone else who wants to follow along is welcome to do so. Without further ado, and I do want to especially recognize Jessica, who's been there for the last few nights. And I think that Granny Bear has been there. And so we want to give a shout out to Granny Bear. So go ahead and make a comment whenever you get this and just say, hey, or whoop, whoop, or whatever, some kind of a shout out comment. And we will know that you are watching. So I appreciate you. All right. Without further ado, now we have Kimberly, who is going to give us the synopsis. Here she is.
So what happened in the last chapter is basically all the doctors, they went over to work on the childlike empress, and they found out that they didn't know what was going on with her. She didn't show any symptoms of any kind of sickness, yet she kept growing weaker. So the best doctor, after finding nothing wrong with her,
Remember that doctor's name?
no, but I know he was a centaur.
Kayron.
Okay. He came up and he had the childlike empress's seal. And the childlike empress had told him to give it to a person named Atreyu from I forget where, but yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
So then he goes over for 10 days, running as fast as he can, and only to find that Atreyu is a little boy who wasn't even he was actually on his hunt to basically it was like a rite of passage, and he was like about to become a man, and then he's like, hey, why'd you stop my hunt? Now I have to do it next year. And then the guy explained, and he was like, okay. And then he goes on to his horse Artex and searches for the cure. And that's basically where we are.
That was Daniel. All right, so, and Mom just commented early tonight because Heavy D, that's me, has to work the night shift tonight. That is correct. I'm working from 12 to 6, so we started a little early so I can hopefully get a little bit of rest before my shift begins. So, without further ado, Chapter 3 of the Neverending Story is called Morla, the Aged One. And when I grew up watching the movie, I thought it was Ancient One, but it is the Aged, Aged. You might misconstrue that word to be aged, Morla, the Aged One, but it is the Aged One. So, all right. And as I said last night, the first letter is C. I don't have my phone with me, so I can't show you what it looks like, but there is a big giant C with there's like some trees in the background that have faces on them, and there's a turtle. So Kimberly's gonna take a picture. Look, she's even in the picture.
I'm not sure if you can see it. There it is.
And as it said when they were describing the book in the bookstore, there's only these letters. That's the only pictures in the book. So, all right. Without further ado, Morla the Aged One. Kayron, the old black centaur, sank back on his bed of furs as Artak's hoofbeats were dying away. After so much exertion, he was at the end of his strength. The women who found him next day in Atreyu's tent feared for his life. and when the hunters came a few days later, he was hardly any better, but he managed nevertheless to tell them why Atreyu had ridden away and would not be back soon. As they were all fond of the boy, their concern for him made them grave. Still, they were proud that the childlike empress had chosen him for the great quest, though none claimed to understand her choice. Old Charon never went back to the ivory tower, but he didn't die, and he didn't stay with the greenskins in the grassy ocean. His destiny was to lead him over a very different and unexpected pathway, but that is another story and shall be told at another time. That same day, Atreyu rode to the foot of the Silver Mountains. It was almost morning when he finally stopped to rest. Artax grazed a while and drank water from a small mountain stream. Atreyu wrapped himself in his red cloak and slept a few hours. But when the sun rose, they were already on their way. On the first day, they crossed the Silver Mountains, where every road and trail was known to them, and they made quick progress. When he felt hungry, the boy ate a chunk of dried buffalo meat and two little grass seed cakes that he had been carrying in his saddlebag. Originally, they had been intended for his hunt. Exactly, said Bastian. A man has to eat now and then. He took his sandwich out of his satchel, unwrapped it, broke it carefully in two pieces, wrapped one of them up again, and put it away. Then he ate the other. Recess was over. Bastian wondered what his class would be doing next. Oh, yes, geography with Mrs. Flint. You had to reel off rivers and their tributaries, cities, population figures, natural resources, and industries. Bastian shrugged his shoulders and went on reading. By sunset, the Silver Mountains lay behind them, and again they stopped to rest. That night, Atreyu dreamed of purple buffaloes. He saw them in the distance roaming over the grassy ocean, and he tried to get near them on his horse. In vain. He galloped, he spurred his horse, but they were always the same distance away. The second day, they passed through the singing tree country. Each tree had a different shape, different leaves, different bark, but all of them in growing, and this was what gave the country its name, made soft music that sounded from far and near and joined in a mighty harmony that hadn't its like for beauty in all Fantastica. Riding through this country wasn't entirely devoid of danger, for many a traveler had stopped still as though spellbound and forgotten everything else. Atreyu felt the power of these marvelous sounds, but didn't let himself be tempted to stop. The following night he dreamed again of purple buffaloes. This time he was on foot, and a great herd of them was passing. But they were beyond the range of his bow, and when he tried to come closer, his feet clung to the ground and he couldn't move them. His frantic efforts to tear them loose woke him up. He started out at once, though the sun had not yet risen. The third day, he saw the glass tower of Erebo, where the inhabitants of the region caught and stored starlight. Out of the starlight, they made wonderfully decorative objects, the purpose of which, however, was known to no one in all Fantastica but their makers. He met some of these folk, little creatures they were, who seemed to have been blown from glass. They were extremely friendly and provided him with food and drink, but when he asked them who might know something about the childlike empress's illness, they sank into a gloomy, perplexed silence. The next night, Atreyu dreamed again that the herd of purple buffaloes was passing. One of the beasts, a particularly large, imposing bull, broke away from his fellows and slowly, with no sign of either fear or anger, approached Atreyu. Like all true hunters, Atreyu knew every creature's vulnerable spot, where an arrow wound would be fatal. The purple buffalo put himself in such a position as to offer a perfect target. Atreyu fitted an arrow to his bow and pulled with all his might, but he couldn't shoot. His fingers seemed to have grown into the bowstring, and he couldn't release it. Each of the following nights he dreamed something of the sort. He got closer and closer to the same purple buffalo. He recognized him by a white spot on his forehead, but for some reason he was never able to shoot the deadly arrow. During the days, he rode farther and farther without knowing where he was going or finding anyone to advise him. The golden amulet he wore was respected by all who met him, but none had an answer to his question. One day he saw from afar the flaming streets of Salamander, the city whose inhabitants' bodies are on fire, but he preferred to keep away from it. He crossed the broad plateau of the Sassafrasians, who are born old and die when they become babies. He came to a jungle temple of Muwamath, where a great moonstone pillar hovers in midair, and he spoke to the monks who lived there, and again no one could tell him anything. He had been traveling aimlessly for almost a week when, on the seventh day and the following night, two very different encounters changed his situation and state of mind. Heron's story of the terrible happenings in all parts of Fantastica had made an impression on him, but thus far the disaster was something he had only heard about. On the seventh day he was to see it with his own eyes. Toward noon he was riding through a dense, dark forest of enormous, gnarled trees. This was the same howling forest where the four messengers had met some time before. That region, as Atreyu knew, was the home of bark trolls. These, as he had been told, were giants and giantesses who themselves looked like gnarled tree trunks. As long as they stood motionless, as they usually did, you could easily mistake them for trees and ride on unsuspecting. Only when they moved could you see that they had branch like arms and crooked root like legs. Though exceedingly powerful, they were not dangerous. At most, they liked to play tricks on travelers who had lost their way. Atreyu had just discovered a woodland meadow with a brook twining through it, and had dismounted to let Artex drink and graze. Suddenly, he heard a loud crackling and thudding in the woods behind him. Three bark trolls emerged from the woods and came toward him. A cold shiver ran down his spine at the sight of them. The first, having no legs or haunches, was obliged to walk on his hands. The second had a hole in his chest, so big you could see through it. The third hopped on his right foot because the whole left half of him was missing, as if he had been cut through the middle. When they saw the amulet hanging from Atreyu's neck, they nodded to one another and came slowly closer. "Don't be afraid," said the one who was walking on his hands, and his voice sounded like the groaning of a tree. "We're not exactly pretty to look at, but in this part of the Howling Forest there's no one else left who might warn you. That's why we've come." "Warn?" Atreyu asked. "Against what?" "We heard about you," moaned the one with the hole in the chest, "and we've been told about your quest. Don't go any further in this direction, or you'll be lost." "The same thing will happen to you as happened to us," sighed the halved one. "Would you like that?" What has happened to you?" Atreyu asked. "The nothing is spreading," groaned the first. "It's growing and growing. There's more of it every day. If it's possible to speak of more nothing. All the others fled from the howling forest in time, but we didn't want to leave our home. The nothing caught us in our sleep, and this is what it did to us." "Is it very painful?" Atreyu asked. "No," said the second bark troll, the one with the hole in his chest. "You don't feel a thing. There's just something missing. And once it gets a hold of you, something more is missing every day. Soon there won't be anything left of us." "In what part of the woods did it begin?" Atreyu asked. "Would you like to see it?" The third troll, who was only half a troll, turned to his fellow sufferers with a questioning look. When they nodded, he said, "We'll take you to a place where there's a good view of it, but you must promise not to go any closer. If you do, it will pull you in." "All right," said Atreyu. I promise. The three turned about and made for the edge of the forest. Leading Artax by the bridle, Atreyu followed them. For a while they went this way and that way between enormous trees. Then finally they stopped at the foot of a giant tree so big that 5 grown men holding hands could scarcely have girdled it. Climb as high as you can, said the legless troll, and look in the direction of the sunrise. Then you'll see, or rather not see it. Atreyu pulled himself up by the knots and bumps on the tree. He reached the lower branches, hoisted himself to the next, climbed and climbed until he lost sight of the ground below him. Higher and higher he went. The trunk grew thinner, and more closely spaced side branches made it easier to climb. When at last he reached the crown, he turned round toward the sunrise, and then he saw it. The tops of the trees nearest him were still green, but the leaves of those farther away seemed to have lost all color. They were gray. A little farther on, the foliage seemed to become strangely transparent, misty, or better still, unreal. And farther still, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not a bare stretch, not darkness, not some lighter color. No, it was something the eyes could not bear, something that made you feel you had gone blind. For no eye can bear the sight of utter nothingness. Atreyu held his hand before his face and nearly fell off his branch. He clung tight for a moment, then climbed down as fast as he could. He had seen enough. At last he really understood the horror that was spreading through Fantastica. When he reached the foot of the great tree, the 3 bark trolls had vanished. Atreyu swung himself into the saddle and galloped as fast as Artax would carry him in the direction that would take him away from this slowly but irresistibly spreading nothing. By nightfall he had left the howling forest far behind him. Only then did he stop to rest. That night a second encounter, which was to give his great quest a new direction, awaited him. He dreamed, much more distinctly than before, of the purple buffalo he had wanted to kill. This time Atreyu was without his bow and arrow. He felt very, very small, and the buffalo's face filled the whole sky. And the face spoke to him. He couldn't understand every word, but this is the gist of what it said. If you had killed me, you would be a hunter now. But because you let me live, I can help you, Atreyu. Listen to me. There is in Fantastica a being older than all other beings. In the north, far, far from here, lie the swamps of sadness. In the middle of those swamps there is a mountain, Tortoise Shell Mountain it's called. There lives Morla, the Aged One. Go and see Morla, the Aged One. Then Atreyu woke up. The clock in the belfry struck 12. Soon Bastian's classmates would be going down to the gym for their last class. Today they'd probably be playing with the big, heavy medicine ball which Bastian handled so awkwardly that neither of the two teams ever wanted him, and sometimes they played with a small, hard rubber ball that hurt terribly when it hit you. Bastian was an easy mark and was always getting hit full force, or perhaps they'd be climbing rope, an exercise that Bastian especially detested. Most of the others would be all the way up to the top, with his face as red as a beet, while he, with his face as red as a beet, would be dangling like a sack of flour at the very bottom of the rope, unable to climb as much as a foot. They'd all be laughing their heads off, and Mr. Minge, the gym teacher, had a special stock of jibes just for Bastian. Bastian would have given a good deal to be like Atreyu. He'd have shown them. He heaved a deep sigh. And I just want to make a comment right here, real fast. I know the clock in the belfry struck 12, and so they're starting their last class. Um, I guess that means that the class gets out at 1 o'clock. And remember, this book was written by Michael Ende, who lived in, what was the name of the town? Um, No, he lived in that in it's in Germany. I can't remember the name of the town. Anyway, that's where he lived, and yeah, they do. Their schools get out really early in Germany, so um, that's I mean, you could just assume that it's like about probably 2:30 or something when they're starting their last class in America. But since this is written in Germany, there it is. All right, so back to the story. Atreyu rode northward, ever northward. He allowed himself and his little horse only the most necessary stops for sleep and food. He rode by day and he rode by night, in the scorching sun and the pelting rain. He looked neither to the left nor the right and asked no more questions. The farther northward he went, the darker it grew. An unchanging, leaden gray twilight filled the days. At night, the northern lights played across the sky. One morning, when time seemed to be standing still in the murky light, he looked out from a hilltop and finally glimpsed the swamps of sadness. Clouds of mist drifted over them. Here and there he distinguished little clumps of trees, their trunks divided at the bottom into 4, 5, or more crooked stilts, which made the trees look like great many-legged crabs standing in the black water. From the brown foliage hung aerial roots resembling motionless tentacles. It was next to impossible to make out where there was solid ground between the pools of water and where there was only a covering of water plants. Artex whinnied with horror. Are we going there, master? Yes, said Atreyu. We must find Tortoise Shell Mountain. It's at the center of those swamps. He urged Artex, and Artex obeyed. Step by step, he tested the firmness of the ground, but that made progress very slow. Garmisch, sorry, that's the name of the town. Just came to my head. At length, Atreyu dismounted and led Artex by the bridle. Several times the horse sank in, but managed to pull himself loose. But the farther they went into the swamps of sadness, the more sluggish became his movements. He let his head droop and barely dragged himself forward. Artex, said Atreyu, what's the matter? I don't know, master. I think we should turn back. There's no sense in all this. We're chasing after something you only dreamed about. We won't find anything. Maybe it's too late. Even now. Maybe the childlike empress is already dead and everything we're doing is useless. Let us turn back, master. Treyu was astonished. Artex, he said, you've never spoken like this. What's the matter? Are you sick? Maybe I am, said Artex. With every step we take, the sadness grows in my heart. I've lost hope, master, and I feel so heavy, I can't go on. But we must go on, cried Atreyu. Come along, Artex. He tugged at the bridle, but Artex stood still. He had sunk in up to his belly, and he made no further effort to extricate himself. Artex, cried Atreyu, you mustn't let yourself go. Come, pull yourself out, or you'll sink. Leave me, master, said the little horse. I can't make it. Go on alone. Don't bother about me. I can't stand the sadness any more. I want to die. Desperately, Atreyu pulled at the bridle, but the horse sank deeper and deeper. When only his head emerged from the black water, Atreyu took it in his arms. I'll hold you, Artex, he whispered. I won't let you go under. The little horse uttered one last soft neigh. You can't help me, master. It's all over for me. Neither of us knew what we were getting into. Now we know why they are called the swamps of sadness. It's the sadness that has made me so heavy. That's why I'm sinking. There's no help. I'm here too, said Atreyu, and I don't feel anything. You're wearing the gem, master, said Artex. It protects you. Then I'll hang it around your neck, Atreyu cried. Maybe it will protect you too. He started taking the chain off his neck. No, the little horse whinnied. You mustn't do that, master. The glory was entrusted to you. You weren't given permission to pass it on as you see fit. You must carry on the quest without me. Atreyu pressed his face into the horse's cheek. Artax, he whispered. Oh, my Artax. Will you grant my last wish? The horse asked. Atreyu nodded in silence. Then I beg you to go away. I don't want you to see my end. Will you do me that favor? Slowly Atreyu arose. Half the horse's head was already in the black water. Farewell, Atreyu, my master, he said, and thank you. Atreyu pressed his lips together. He couldn't speak. Once again, he nodded to Artax. Then he turned away. Bastian was sobbing. He couldn't help it. His eyes filled with tears, and he couldn't go on reading. He had to take out his handkerchief and blow his nose before he could go on. Atreyu waited and waited. For how long he didn't know. The mist grew thicker, and he felt as if he were blind and deaf. It seemed to him that he had been wandering around in circles for hours. He stopped worrying about where to set his foot down, and yet he never sank in above his knees. By some mysterious means, the childlike Empress's amulet led him the right way. Then suddenly he saw a high, steep mountain ahead of him. Pulling himself up from crag to crag, he climbed to the rounded top. At first he didn't notice what this mountain was made of, but from the top he overlooked the whole mountain, and then he saw that it consisted of great slabs of tortoise shell, with moss growing in the crevices between them. He had found Tortoise Shell Mountain, but the discovery gave him no pleasure. Now that his faithful little horse was gone, it left him almost indifferent. Still, he would have to find out who this Morla, the Aged One, was, and where she actually lived. While he was mulling it over, he felt a slight tremor shaking the mountain. Then he heard a hideous wheezing and lip smacking, and a voice that seemed to issue from the innermost bowels of the earth. Snakes alive, old woman. Somebody's crawling around on us. In hurrying to the edge of the ridge where the sounds had come from, Atreyu had slipped on a bed of moss. Since there was nothing for him to hold on to, he slid faster and faster and finally fell off the mountain. Luckily, he landed on a tree which caught him in its branches. Although I'm not sure if that's so lucky because have you ever landed in a tree? That's not really a pleasant thing. Sorry, that's my commentary right there. Looking back at the mountain, he saw an enormous cave. Water was splashing and gushing inside, and something was moving. Slowly, the something came out. It looked like a boulder as big as a house. When it came into full sight, Atreyu saw that it was a head attached to a long, wrinkled neck, the head of a turtle. Its eyes were black and as big as ponds. The mouth was dripping with muck and water weeds. This whole tortoise-shell mountain, it suddenly dawned on Atreyu, was one enormous beast, a giant swamp turtle, Morla, the Aged One. The wheezing, gurgling voice spoke again. What are you doing here, son? Atreyu reached for the amulet on his chest and held it in such a way that the great eyes couldn't help seeing it. You recognize this, Morla? She took a while to answer. Snakes alive, Oren! We haven't seen that in a long time, have we, old woman? The emblem of the childlike empress. Not in a long time. The childlike empress is sick, said Atreyu. Did you know that? It's all the same to us, isn't it, old woman? Morla replied. She seemed to be talking to herself, perhaps because she had no one else to talk to for heavens knows how long. If we don't save her, she'll die, Atreyu cried out. The nothing is spreading everywhere. I've seen it myself. Morla stared at him out of her great, empty eyes. We don't mind, do we, old woman? But then we shall all die, Atreyu screamed. Every last one of us. Six alive, said Morla. But what do we care? Nothing matters to us any more. It's all the same to us. But you'll be destroyed too, Morla, cried Atreyu angrily. Or do you expect, because you're so old, to outlive Fantastica? Sakes alive, Morla gurgled. We're old, son. Much too old. Lived long enough. Seen too much. When you know as much as we do, nothing matters. Things just repeat, day and night, summer and winter. The world is empty and aimless. Everything circles around. Whatever starts up must pass away. Whatever is born must die. It all cancels out, good and bad, beautiful and ugly. Everything's empty. Nothing is real. Nothing matters. Atreyu didn't know what to answer. The aged one's dark, empty, pond-sized eyes paralyzed his thoughts. After a while, he heard her speak again. You're young, son. If you were as old as we are, you'd know there's nothing but sadness. Why shouldn't we die, you and I, the childlike empress, the whole lot of us? Anyway, it's all flim-flam, meaningless games. Nothing matters. Leave us in peace, son. Go away. Atreyu tensed his will to fight off the paralysis that flowed from her eyes. If you know so much, he said, you must know what the childlike empress illness is, and whether there's a cure for it. We do, don't we, old woman? Morla wheezed. But it's all the same to us whether she's saved or not. So why should we tell you? If it's really all the same to you, Atreyu argued, you might just as well tell me. Couldn't we, old woman? Morla grunted. But we don't feel like it. Then it's not all the same to you. Then you yourself don't believe what you're saying. After a long silence, he heard a deep gurgling and belching. That must have been some kind of laughter, if Morla the aged one was still capable of laughing. In any case, she said, You're a sly one, son. Really sly. We haven't had so much fun in a long time, have we, old woman? Sakes alive, it's true. We might just as well tell you. Makes no difference. Should we tell him, old woman? A long silence followed. Atreyu waited anxiously for Morla's answer, taking care not to interrupt the slow, cheerless flow of her thoughts. At last she spoke. Your life is short, son. Ours is long, much too long. But we both live in time. You a short time, we a long time. The childlike empress has always been there. But she's not old. She has always been young. She still is. Her life isn't measured by time, but by names. She needs a new name. She keeps needing new names. Do you know her name, son? No, Atreyu admitted. I've never heard it. You couldn't have, said Morla. Not even we can remember it, yet she has had many names. But they're all forgotten, over and done with. But without a name, she can't live. All the childlike Empress needs is a new name, then she'll get well. But it makes no difference whether she gets well or not. She closed her pond-sized eyes and began slowly to pull in her head. Wait, cried Atreyu. Where can she get a name? Who can give her one? Where can I find the name? None of us, Morla gurgled. No inhabitant of Fantastica can give her a new name. So it's hopeless, sakes alive. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. Who then? Cried Atreyu in despair. Who can give her the name that will save her and save us all? Don't make so much noise, said Morla. Leave us in peace and go away. Even we don't know who can give her a name. If you don't know, Treya screamed even louder, who does? She opened her eyes a last time. If you weren't wearing the gem, she wheezed, we'd eat you up just to have peace and quiet, sakes alive. Who? Treyu insisted. Tell me who knows and I'll leave you in peace forever. It doesn't matter, she replied, but maybe Eulala in the Southern Oracle knows. She may know. It's all the same to us. How can I get there? You can't get there at all, my son. Not in 10,000 days' journey. Your life is too short. You'd die first. It's too far in the south, much too far, so it's all hopeless. We told you so in the first place, didn't we, old woman? Sakes alive, son, give it up, and most important, leave us in peace. With that, she closed her empty gazing eyes and pulled her head back into the cave for good. Atreyu knew he would learn no more from her. At the same time, the shadowy being which had condensed out of the darkness of the heath picked up Atreyu's trail and headed for the swamps of sadness. Nothing and no one in all Fantastica would deflect it from that trail. Bastian had propped his head on his hand and was looking thoughtfully into space. Strange, he said aloud, that no one in all Fantastica can give the childlike Empress a new name. It had been just a matter of giving her a name. Bastian could easily have helped her. He was tops at that. But unfortunately, he was not in Fantastica, where his talents were needed, and would even have won him friends and admirers. On the other hand, he was glad not to be there. Not for anything in the world would he have ventured into such a place as the swamps of sadness. And then this spooky creature of darkness that was chasing Atreyu without his knowing it. Bastian would have liked to warn him. That was impossible. All he could do was hope and go on reading. The next chapter is chapter 4, Ygramul the Many. And the first letter is D. No, we're doing letters for this book. Is Ben asleep? Daniel, are you awake? Daniel might be awake, he said. Can you hear me with the door closed? Can you hear me with the door closed? Yeah? Timmy, are you awake? Okay, so this chapter. All right, so who votes that we keep going? If you're Okay. Are you okay with it, Ben? Okay. Is Jessica listening? I've got okay. I've got one viewer. It might be mom, but okay. So see how we're doing. All right. So this chapter is chapter 4, Yagramul the Many. Dire hunger and thirst pursued Atreyu. It was 2 days since he had left the swamps of sadness, and since then he had been wandering through an empty rocky wilderness. What little provisions he had taken with him had sunk beneath the black waters with Artax. In vain Atreyu dug his fingers into the clefts between the stones in the hope of finding some little root, but nothing grew there, not even moss or lichen. At first he was glad to feel solid ground beneath his feet. JJ, are we having trouble? Da, 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 da. But little by little it came to him that he was worse off than ever. He was lost. I don't think JJ can handle another chapter. Okay, why don't you show me by getting in your bed? I'm going to keep on reading, but you can go on get in your bed, okay? While I'm reading, I'll tuck you in when I'm done with the chapter. Maybe Becca can tuck you in the meantime. At first he was glad to feel solid ground beneath his feet, but little by little it came to him that he was worse off than ever. He was lost. He didn't know what direction he was going in, for the dusky grayness was all the same all around him. A cold wind blew over the needle-like rocks that rose up on all sides, blew and blew. Uphill and downhill he plodded, but all he saw was distant mountains with still more distant ranges but behind him, and so on to the horizon on all sides, and nothing living, not a beetle, not an ant, not even the vultures which ordinarily follow the weary traveler until he falls by the wayside. Doubt was no longer possible. This was the land of the dead mountains. Few had seen them, and fewer still escaped from them alive. But they figured in the legends of Atreyu's people. He remembered an old song. Better the huntsman should perish in the swamps, for in the dead mountains there is a deep, deep chasm, where dwelleth Yagramul the Many, the horror of horrors. Even if Atreyu had wanted to turn back and had known what direction to take, it would not have been possible. He had gone too far and could only keep on going. If only he himself had been involved, he might have sat down in a cave and quietly waited for death, as the greenskin hunters did. But he was engaged in the great quest. The life of the childlike empress and of all Fantastica was at stake. He had no right to give up, and so he kept at it, uphill and down. From time to time he realized that he had been walking as though in his sleep, that his mind had been in other realms from which they had returned none too willingly. Bastian gave a start. The clock in the belfry struck 1. School was over for the day. He heard the shouts and screams of the children running into the corridors from the classrooms and the clatter of the many feet on the stairs. For a while there were isolated shouts from the streets, and then the schoolhouse was engulfed in silence. The silence descended on Bastian like a great heavy blanket and threatened to smother him. From then on he would be all alone in the big schoolhouse all that day, all that night. There was no knowing how long. This adventure of his was getting serious. The other children were going home for lunch. Bastian was hungry too, and he was cold in spite of the army blankets he was wrapped in. Suddenly he lost heart. His whole plan seemed crazy, senseless. He wanted to go home that very minute. He could just be in time. His father wouldn't have noticed anything yet. Bastian wouldn't even have to tell him he had played hooky. Of course, it would come out sooner or later, but there was time to worry about that. But the stolen book? Yes, he'd have to own up to that too. In the end, his father would resign himself as he did to all the disappointments Bastian had given him. Anyway, there was nothing to be afraid of. Most likely his father wouldn't say anything, but just go and see Mr. Coriander and straighten things out. Bastian was about to put the copper-colored book into his satchel, but then he stopped. No, he said aloud in the stillness of the attic. Atreyu wouldn't give up just because things were getting a little rough. What I've started, I must finish. I've gone too far to turn back. Regardless of what may happen, I have to go forward. He felt very lonely, yet there was a kind of pride in his loneliness. He was proud of standing firm in the face of temptation. He was a little like Atreyu after all. Just 1 minute, I need to check on something. JJ, you need to stop for the night. Sorry about that. A time came when Atreyu really could not go forward. Before him lay the deep chasm. The grandiose horror of the sight cannot be described in words. Just 1 minute. We'll have to stop for the night then. Because JJ will stop moving. All right, we'll try. Atreyu lay on a spur at the edge of the chasm and stared down into darkness which seemed to extend to the innermost heart of the earth. He picked up a stone the size of a tennis ball and hurled it as far as he could. The stone fell and fell until it was swallowed up in the darkness. Though Atreyu listened a long while, he heard no sound of impact. There was only one thing Atreyu could do, and he did it. He skirted the deep chasm. Every second he expected to meet the horror of horrors, known to him from the old song. He had no idea what sort of creature this might be. All he knew was that its name was Yagramul. The deep chasm twisted and turned through the mountain waste, and of course there was no path at its edge. Here, too, there were abrupt rises and falls, and sometimes the ground swayed alarmingly under Atreyu's feet. Sometimes his path was barred by gigantic rock formations, and he would have to feel his way painfully step by step around them, or there would be slopes covered with smooth stones that would start rolling toward the chasm as soon as he set foot on them. More than once he was within hairbreadth of the edge. If he had known that a pursuer was close behind him and coming closer by the hour, he might have hurried and taken dangerous risks. It was that creature of darkness which had been after him since the start of his journey. Since then its body had taken on recognizable outlines. It was a pitch-black wolf the size of an ox. Nose to the ground, it trotted along, following Atreyu's trail through the stony desert of the Dead Mountains. Its tongue hung far out of its mouth, and its terrifying fangs were bared. The freshness of the scent told the wolf that its prey was only a few miles ahead, but suspecting nothing of his pursuer, Atreyu picked his way slowly and cautiously. As he was groping through the darkness of a tunnel under a mountain, he suddenly heard a noise that he couldn't identify because it bore no resemblance to any sound he had ever heard. It was a kind of jangling roar. At the same time, Atreyu felt the whole mountain about him was trembling, and he heard blocks of stone crashing down its outer walls. For a time he waited to see whether the earthquake or whatever it might be would abate. Then, since it did not, he crawled to the end of the tunnel and cautiously stuck his head out. And then he saw an enormous spider web was stretched from edge to edge of the deep chasm, and in the sticky threads of the web, which were as thick as ropes, a great white luck dragon was struggling, becoming more and more entangled as he thrashed about with his tail and claws. Luck dragons are among the strangest animals in Fantastica. They bear no resemblance to ordinary dragons, which look like loathsome snakes and live in deep caves, diffusing a nauseous stench and guarding some real or imaginary treasure. Such spawn of chaos are usually wicked or ill tempered. They have bat like wings with which they can rise clumsily and noisily into the air, and they spew fire and smoke. Luck dragons are creatures of air, warmth, and pure joy. Despite their great size, they are as light as a summer cloud, and consequently need no wings for flying. They swim in the air of heaven as fish swim in water. Seen from the earth, they look like slow lightning flashes. The most amazing thing about them is their song. Their voice sounds like the golden note of a large bell, and when they speak softly, the bell seems to be ringing in the distance. Anyone who has heard this sound will remember it as long as he lives and tell his grandchildren about it. But the luck dragon Atreyu saw could hardly have been in a mood for singing. His long, graceful body, with its pearly pink and white scales, hung dangled and twisted in the great spider web. His bristling fangs, his thick, luxuriant mane, and the fringes on his tail and limbs were all caught in the sticky ropes. He could hardly move. The eyeballs in his lion-like head glistened ruby red. The splendid beast bled from many wounds, for there was something else, something very big that descended like a dark cloud on the dragon's white body. It rose and fell, all the while changing its shape. Sometimes it resembled a gigantic long-legged spider with many fiery eyes and a fat body encased in shaggy black hair. Then it became a great hand with long claws that tried to crush the luck dragon, and in the next moment it changed to a great scorpion, piercing its unfortunate victim with its venomous sting. The battle between the two giants was fearsome. The luck dragon was still defending himself, spewing blue fire that singed the cloud monster's bristles. Smoke came whirling through the crevices in the rock, so foul smelling that Atreyu could hardly breathe. Once the luck dragon managed to bite off one of the monster's long legs, but instead of falling into the chasm, the severed leg hovered for a time in midair, then returned to its old place in the black cloud body. And several times the dragon seemed to seize one of the monster's limbs between his teeth, but bit into the void. Only then did Atreyu notice that the monster was not a single solid body, but was made up of innumerable small steel blue insects which buzzed like angry hornets. It was their compact swarm that kept taking different shapes. This was Yggdrasil, and now Atreyu knew why she was called the Many. He sprang from his hiding place, reached for the gem, and shouted at the top of his lungs, "Stop! In the name of the childlike empress, stop!" But the hissing and roaring of the combatants drowned out his voice. He himself could barely hear it. Without stopping to think, he set foot on the sticky ropes of the web, which swayed beneath him as he ran. He lost his balance, fell, clung by his hands to keep from falling into the dark chasm, pulled himself up again, caught himself in the ropes, fought free, and hurried on. At last Yggdrasil sensed that something was coming toward her. With the speed of lightning, she turned about, confronting Atreyu with an enormous steel blue face. Her single eye had a vertical pupil which stared at Atreyu with inconceivable malignancy. A cry of fear escaped Bastian. A cry of terror passed through the ravine and echoed from side to side. Yggdrasil turned her eye to the left and right to see if someone else had arrived, for that sound could not have been made by the boy who stood there as though paralyzed with horror. Could she have heard my cry? Sebastian wondered in alarm. But that's not possible. And then Atreyu heard Yggdrasil's voice. It was very high and slightly hoarse, not at all the right kind of voice for that enormous face. Her lips did not move as she spoke. It was the buzzing of a great swarm of hornets that shaped itself into words. A two legs, Atreyu heard. Years upon years of hunger, and now two tasty morsels at once. A lucky day for Ygramul. Atreyu needed all his strength to keep his composure. He held the gem up to the monster's one eye and asked, You know this emblem? Come closer, two legs, buzzed the many voices. Ygramul doesn't see well. Atreyu took one step closer to the face. The mouth opened, showing innumerable glittering feelers, hooks, and claws in place of a tongue. Still closer, the swarm buzzed. He took one more step, which brought him near enough to distinguish the innumerable steel blue insects which whirled around in seeming confusion, yet the face as a whole remained motionless. I am Atreyu, he said. I have come on a mission from the childlike empress. Most inopportune, said the angry buzzing after a time. What do you want of Ygramul? As you can see, she is very busy. I want this luck dragon, said Atreyu. Let me have him. What do you want him, Atreyu? What do you want him for, Atreyu Two Legs? I lost my horse in the swamps of sadness. I must go to the Southern Oracle because only Eulala can tell me who can give the childlike empress a new name. If she doesn't get one, she will die, and all Fantastica with her. You too, Ygramul. Ah, the face drawled. Is that the reason for all the places where there is nothing? Yes, said Atreyu, so you too know of them. But the Southern Oracle is too long a journey for my lifetime. That's why I'm asking for this luck dragon. If he carries me through the air, I may get there before it's too late. Out of the whirling swarm that made up the face came a sound suggesting the giggling of many voices. You're all wrong, Atreyu Two Legs. We know nothing of the Southern Oracle and nothing of Eulala. But we do know that this luck dragon cannot carry you, and even if he were in the best of health, the trip would take so long that the childlike empress would die of her illness in the meantime. You must measure your quest, Atreyu, in terms not of your own life, but of hers. The gaze of the eye with the vertical pupil was almost unbearable. That's true, he said in a small voice. Besides, the motionless face went on, the luck dragon has Ygramul's poison in its body. He has less than an hour to live. Then there's no hope, Atreyu murmured. Not for him, not for me, and not for you either, Ygramul. Oh, well, the voice buzzed. Your grandma would at least have one good meal, but who's to say it's your grandma's last meal? She knows a way of getting you to the Southern Oracle in a twinkling, but the question is, will you like it? What is that way? That is Ygramul's secret. The creatures of darkness have their secrets too, Atreyu Two Legs. Ygramul has never revealed hers, and you too must swear you'll never tell a soul, for it would greatly it would be for it would be greatly to Ygramul's disadvantage if it were known, yes, greatly to her disadvantage. I swear, speak! The great steel blue face leaned forward just a little and buzzed almost inaudibly. You must let Ygramul bite you. Atreyu shrank back in horror. Ygramul's poison, the voice went on, kills within an hour. but to one who has it inside, it gives the power to wish himself in any part of Fantastica he chooses. Imagine if that were known, all Yagramul's victims would escape her. An hour, cried Atreyu. What can I do in an hour? Well, buzzed the swarm, at least it's more than all the hours remaining to you here. Atreyu struggled within himself. Will you set the luck dragon free as if I ask it in the name of the childlike empress? He finally asked. No, said the face. You have no right to ask that of Yagramul, even if you are wearing Auron, the gem. The childlike empress takes us all as we are. That's why Yagramul respects her emblem. Atreyu was still standing with bowed head. Yagramul had spoken the truth. He couldn't save the white luck dragon. His own wishes didn't count. He looked up and said, Do what you suggested. Instantly, the steel blue cloud descended on him and enveloped him on all sides. He felt a numbing pain in the left shoulder. His last thought was, To the Southern Oracle. Then the world went black before his eyes. When the wolf reached the spot a short time later, he saw the giant spider web, but there was no one in sight. There the trail he had been following broke off, and try as he might, he could not find it again. Bastian stopped reading. He felt miserable, as though he himself had Yagramul's poison inside of him. Thank goodness I'm not in Fantastica, he muttered. Luckily, such monsters don't exist in reality. Anyway, it's only a story. But was it only a story? How did it happen that Yagramul, and probably Atreyu as well, had heard Bastian's cry of terror? Little by little, this book was beginning to give him a spooky feeling. Chapter 5 is called The Gnomics, and the first letter is E, and we'll have to read that tomorrow. So I wish you all well. I wish you good night, and God bless you, and we will read the next chapter tomorrow. Good night.